This is Chapter 9 in the Political Ideologies class. Here we're talking about ecology as an ideology and green politics. Let's talk about what we mean by green politics or environmental politics. We're looking at ecologism or environmentalism, responding to environmental crises or crises to the biosphere of our planet. This is the result of human actions, for the most part, that are bringing up problems worth addressing and dealing with, or as a part of our human capacity to try to control nature and create technology that's going to make our lives better. Well, then we're going to see some byproducts of these technological innovations. And one of the critiques of green politics is warning about the idea of putting humans above nature, using humans to pursue our own self-interest at perhaps the expense of nature. The advocates of green-leaning politics, you could say, have varied. Just some interesting examples going all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt, Republican president, who considered himself as somewhat of a rugged outdoorsman, and he was one of the primary inspirations for the creation of our national park systems at the turn of going into the 20th century. Richard Nixon, also Republican president, is credited with creating the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as OSHA, which is Occupational Safety and Health Administration, creating both of those through executive orders. And the religious mindset has had some influence throughout modern history as far as paying a little bit more attention to our environment, and since it was created by God, and that there might be some sacred duty to care for our environment, our surroundings on the earth. The primary critique from the green ecological, political motivations is that here on earth there is quite a vast myriad of species on the planet that are independent with each other, relying on each other. This is what we call the biosphere, that it's evolved over millions, a couple of billion or more years into the system that we have. And there's reasons why it's evolved like it has is because of the biodiversity, interdependence of the species. Some very obvious examples is that trees emit oxygen and absorb CO2 that we breathe out. And if you have more CO2 coming out than the trees can take in, then what we might be seeing here is a greenhouse effect, which is a warming effect where excessive amounts of CO2 are trapping the heat into our atmosphere, seeing a rise over the last few decades, increasing average rise in temperatures. This has led to correlations with it. You can say that necessarily that global warming or climate change has caused these things, but they have contributed to it based on scientific evidence as to where we see more droughts, and the droughts have also led to other things such as increasing fires, where you have a longer dry season and more forestry that is susceptible to fires. We have rise in ocean temperatures, which could also have other serious long-term effects. And as the temperatures rise, whether it's in the atmosphere or in the ocean, then ice caps are showing to be melting as well, and that would increase sea levels, which could affect people that are living in coastal areas, and that's where we're already potentially starting to see environmental migrants, to where people are having to move from low-lying areas, in some cases in poor developing countries, and they're having to be moving somewhere else to areas where people might not want them to move to. So we've got lots of things with respect to the environment that are becoming an increasing concern. Another critique of our current system is the idea that humans are increasingly mastering nature. This is called anthropocentrism, or a human-centered mindset, to where the earth revolves around the humans, which have evolved to have conscious thought and then have been able to invent things in order to control nature, make our lives more comfortable and more successful and more profitable and things like that, in addition to the economic concepts of capitalism, which are constantly driving productive forces, innovation, and change. And because we've been raised and socialized and put into a capitalist system where we have to work and make money and constantly be growing, well, we have generally a preference of economic growth over the protection of the environment in general. If you poll the average person, that's typically what we see because of the system that we've been raised in. So is there some sort of ethic that the ecological ideology can start to create, which might be going from the anthropocentric, human-centered mindset to a more biocentric or ecocentric type idea that stresses the mutual dependence of species on each other, the sense of connectedness between all the species on Earth, that nature is not a commodity for humans to try to modify or create for their own desires and pleasures and profits and things like that, and to recognize the extent of our power as humans, that we could be doing what we could be doing to nature, accept responsibility for that, as well as being aware of the cumulative effects that could be working on the environment to degrade the environment. The book gives a few examples, such as the styrofoam cups that end up in landfills and take a very long time to biodegrade, insecticides, which, yes, may help us to grow more crops, but it could also be putting chemicals into the crops and affecting our health, things like that. So stewardship is just the idea of accepting the responsibility, particularly for future generations, with the idea that it might be considered unjust for the present generation to pass on these problems or potential burdens to the future generations. And you may have heard that joke, well, what have future generations ever done for us? All right, so that's part of the problem, but that's way off in the future, might not be something that we normally worry about. And that's kind of what we do, is discount the future. The more distant the benefit, the greater the future benefit must be to compensate for the delay in receiving it. So basically what that's saying generally is that we have a pretty big difficulty looking beyond our own lifetime. You know, what's it going to matter, you know, once we're gone? Well, it's certainly going to matter to the people that are still going to be here, or the future generations. And then the question that we would perhaps ask ourselves, well, the individual sacrifices that I do, would that actually do someone else some good? People are going to have to come to consensus that says, well, yes, there are some sacrifices that we could make that would provide an overall collective benefit. So let's review kind of what a public good is. We've talked a little bit earlier on about the classic public goods, such as national defense and our education system and infrastructure like roads, transportation, or even libraries. And on the local level, we're looking at police departments and fire departments, things like that. So public goods are considered non-rival, that my use of it does not prevent your use of it. We both enjoy that same benefit. So public goods are indivisible. You can't divide people out from not being able to use that, whereas with a private good, we can actually keep people from using it by locking the back door to the movie theater or charging a price that keeps people out if they can't afford that price. So with public good, they're indivisible, don't have the ability to do that, and so therefore that makes them also non-excludable, because once it's been provided, everybody is able to use it. Once the national defense is provided, everybody can benefit from that. And so another problem that we have with public goods we've touched on before is the issue of free riders, that a lot of people are getting the benefit from that public good but may not actually be contributing to it, whatever that may be. May not be paying their taxes or putting in sort of any kind of input into it that helps it exist, and then just enjoying the benefits of it. So therefore, the clean air is a good example of a public good. And we all enjoy the benefits of the clean air that our planet provides for us. And of course, it's a global good because eventually it's going to go around the entire planet. But someone can enjoy that clean air without necessarily doing anything to help reduce air pollution. So that's what we're dealing with here, is the biosphere. And this includes our oceans and our rivers. They are considered global public goods. Here's an example of how we tend to put things off according to our human nature. We're not always rational calculators. This is a published study from behavioral economics. Here's the question. Would you rather get $100 today or $110 tomorrow? Which do you choose? We'll talk about that here in a second, of what most people choose. Now let's look at another question. Would you choose between $100 a month from now or $110 a month plus 1 day from now? So interestingly enough, both of those questions give you the same benefit. However, the majority of people, for number one, choose the $100 today because they want that in their hands right now. I don't want that tomorrow. I see that $100 dangled in front of me. I get it right now. Interestingly enough, for number two, the overwhelming majority of people preferred to wait one more day longer. And of course, that makes sense because a month away, it doesn't really matter to you until it gets closer, of course. But what's the difference between 31 days in the future and 32 days in the future? That's really no difference. So therefore, the majority of people choose the higher amount. When we start to get closer to the present, we're less rational. So we're able to make a rational choice when we're thinking about the future, because as you can see, not a whole lot of difference in time right here, and so I can get $10 more. But as the present gets closer, short-term considerations overwhelm long-term goals. Our desires shift as the long run becomes the short run. So that's kind of in our nature. We're not normally rational calculators anyway, as I've talked before in a couple of previous things that we've discussed. Human beings don't typically plan for the future. It's one of the reasons why we have a Social Security system, because if we didn't, the majority of people, once they get to that age of retirement, they wouldn't have any money saved. So what we have here is a collective action problem, and a very famous article written by a scientist called The Tragedy of Commons kind of explains this collective action problem, where there's a pasture and all of the herders can graze on that pasture however they see fit. But once one herder starts to realize that, hey, if I can squeeze a couple of more cows or sheep on there and increase my profit, then what's the big deal? Who's going to stop me? But however, if all the other grazers or herders start doing that same thing and they all start increasing their herd in order to get more profit, therefore they end up overgrazing the pasture and ruin it to where it may not be sustainable. So the point of this is that we cannot always rely on voluntary efforts, particularly when you're looking at a commons such as the ocean or the atmosphere. Those are considered global commons. So how do you resolve that? Well, there's lots of things you could potentially do. You could make it private property, and therefore that person that owns that area can do what he wants to with it. And of course, it would be in his best rational interest to make sure that that pasture was sustained for his particular herd. Or if we make it a public use, then we can figure out ways how to dole it out. We could allocate it out to certain people, or have first come, first serve and then limit the use to it. Or we could even have a user pays principle. There's lots of things that we could do, but guess what? All of those require some sort of political decision making in order to do that. So what the author is talking about here is that we kind of consent to a mutual coercion, and that requires politics for us to be able to do that. And that means how do we control this? Is it through taxes, penalties, rules, regulations, limitations? And then in a free democratic society that was based on the concept of liberalism, which talks about limited government, how can we minimize these? Can we minimize these things even though we need to implement them in order for this to sustain or survive? So then it talks about how each of us technically are bearing individual responsibility to do that, but obviously we have to agree to be coerced to do this through political organization. Now, with any political or ideological movement, there's different factions, there's different groups. Here we've got different shades of green politics. The light green side of the ecological ideology is that, well, we still want to serve human needs because we're here and we want to stay here, but we also want to minimize the damage to the environment as well. But the dark green or the deep green shade is looking at more radical measures in protecting the environment and literally putting humans back down on par with other species in the world. So as you can see, those are some pretty big divides there. And then you've got other ways you can look at it. The book talks about the garden view of green politics, where we need to cultivate the earth carefully and reverently. All right, so that's being cautious in cultivating the earth because we need to grow plants in order to feed ourselves. And this contrasts with what is called a wilderness view that takes the other side that, well, what we're doing is despoiling the earth. Humans are not masters over the nature. And what we want to look for more is a biotic community where we are more integrated with the earth, with nature. And of course, that brings up other questions as to how do we feed ourselves with that type of interaction. So looking at a potentially new environmental ethic here seems to be some common directions despite the different shades of green, but typically more of a non-Western view, which is pro-capitalist and pro-growth, pro-development, which are all potentially harmful to the environment. Mill's, John Stuart Mill's harm principle could also apply here, is that we do what we want to do as long as it doesn't harm, in this case, as long as it doesn't harm nature, because Mill's principle was that we basically can do what we want to do as long as we don't harm other humans. So we could be looking at a variation of that. Or do we want to look at it more as a sacred duty to protect the environment, or more of a scientific approach in looking at the environment? So some of these can share a few common ideas: respecting life, the reverence of nature, the awe of nature, that this is what we sprang out of and we are a part of this, the obligation to the future, whether you want that to be more of a principle or just literally a rational idea to help our species survive in the future. The increasing population, we are projected to be probably at least 9 billion people on this earth by mid-century, maybe as high as 11 billion by the end of the century. And that's going to create a sustainability problem of feeding all of these people as well as all the resources. By that time, we might even be out of oil if we continue to pump oil at that rate that we're going now, which of course is contributing to the degradation of the environment as well. And the idea that nature can fight back, we've been seeing that a little bit more recently with the more prevalence of floods. Again, these are not necessarily caused by global warming, but we are seeing an increased correlation with rising temperatures that gives more volatile weather patterns, more extremes, more floods. I've already talked about more fires, more droughts. And interestingly enough, considering what we are facing right now, potentially more diseases out there in nature that could be enhanced or facilitated a little bit more with a warming climate. The other view, or part of this view, could include that the chief culprits here, we can't necessarily blame all humans, but that the more privileged or the rich and powerful could do more in order to try to pursue this more environmental political approach. Just like with a lot of political ideologies, tend to agree on the end goals that we want to achieve, but the means is where we see the differences. How do we want to pursue that? The more activist approach, we're looking at some examples here with the Green Party, looking at more pursuing of grassroots. Again, that's kind of a pun that with respect to our environmental theme here, but looking from the ground up of people coming together and pushing upward against the status quo or the power elites. Perhaps even looking at more of an anti-pro-growth political platform. And of course, that's going to have some major opposition, so that's where it's going to require quite a bit of compromise. Ecotage is kind of a play on words of ecological or environmental sabotage, which could be breaking the law, so that's another thing that would be on the extreme side. But there's other forms of direct action that might get more attention and get more results. Now, Greenpeace has been a very newsworthy environmental NGO, and they have kind of taken it upon themselves to actually get out there in the ocean and try to harass whaling ships that are harvesting whales, televising it, trying to get a little bit more awareness. The International Court of Justice, might have mentioned this in a previous class, there was a case brought against Japan from Australia about Japan continuing their whaling program under the guise of research, and the ICJ ruled against Japan in that case. Now, Sierra Club is another prominent environmental group that looks at another form of direct action of lobbying. You know, they have lots of members and raise lots of funds, and the members can do a lot of legwork, but lobbying Congress is one of the best ways of getting their attention. This is something that I would talk about more in another class as far as the political process. The pursuit of ecological activism is fairly critical of federal efforts where may not be seeing enough enforcement and oversight as far as environmental rules and regulations. Under the Obama administration, in general, more sympathetic to environmental issues, but if you do not have a consensus throughout government, then those actions that a president would do or a platform that a president may pursue that's fairly pro-environmental, those could be through executive orders, which could be easily overturned by the subsequent administration. And for example, the book seems to be fairly critical of the current Trump administration as far as its anti-green policies. Trump has appointed several anti-environmentalists to agency head positions. So even though the bureaucrats are sustaining their jobs for the most part through administrations, they do have to respond to the agenda that's at the top. So we might start seeing more pollution restrictions lifted or reversed or just not enforced. If those departments are reduced as far as manpower, then the environmental regulations may not be enforced as well. Also, under the current administration, opened up more public land for oil and gas drilling. Now, the United States is now the #1 oil producer in the world of all the countries. Also, forbidding agencies from collecting and disseminating data about global warming. In some cases, not quite subtle pressure to silence scientists from speaking out on global warming, and we've actually seen some scientists, whether it's in the EPA or other groups, have actually resigned in protest from some of these policies. And one of the more publicized events, because it was just an agreement, the Trump administration rescinded the U.S. participation in the Paris Accords. So as you can see here, as we pointed out, almost every one of these points is the exact opposite of what the Obama administration had been trying to work towards. So this brings up another point, since we don't talk about this much in this class, but in other classes I talk quite a bit about elections and voting, and the fact that America has an extremely low voter turnout. And when you ask people, particularly of your age group, why you don't vote, well, one of the biggest excuses is, well, my vote doesn't really matter. You know, who cares who gets president? It's really not that big a deal. Who gets president, not that big of a difference between them. Well, this provides a very good example of yes, it does matter. When you look at this particular issue here, how different they are. Again, I'm not saying what's right, wrong, good, or bad. I'm just saying that there are clear differences between the previous administration policies and the current administration policies on these particular things. Looking at the concept of eco-psychology, well, this is where we may have to delve down a little bit deeper into our nature and to try to pursue this issue and promote somewhat of a kinship with our environment. What are the emotional costs to our environmental degradation? Is this innate affection for nature, is it starting to get lost? This reverence and awe that I talked about before, is that look at this, that took billions of years to create, and then we sprang from this. Have we lost that sense of affection and awe of the nature that we are in? So looking at ecology as an ideology, big question, of course, is this anthropocentric idea that humans are disregarding of the interconnected web of life, the arrogance of the human desire to control nature to make our lives better at the expense of an environment. What kind of worldwide change of consciousness could we perhaps try to promote? Well, individual responsibility within a political framework. That's what I tried to describe earlier. How do we maximize individual participation to care more about the environment, or to perhaps be more conserving in their use of products, or to be a little bit more aware of the idea of sustainability? Now, a lot of this points at a decentralized, grassroots, ground-up type system in order to try to get this going, but this does have some difficulties with respect to human nature. Humans still prefer economic growth, development, and jobs over preservation of nature. Whether it's Alaska or New York City, if you poll humans in general, that's still more of a priority. So that's something that we would have to deal with. Most environmental issues, again, know no boundaries, in that air and water pollution, those are most definitely international, regional type situations because they cross borders. And perhaps in general, we're looking at global problems. Global problems would require global solutions. Radioactive waste, regardless of where that's produced or stored, it's going to be around for thousands of years. So that's another thing that's hard to approach on a decentralized grassroots level. In fact, if we wanted to pick up more nuclear energy in order to see, this is a very fascinating dilemma. Our trade-off that we can find ourselves in is that, well, we don't want to burn natural gas and coal and oil because of the fossil fuels and the greenhouse gases. Well, what would be a very viable alternative to that? Well, nuclear energy would be a very viable alternative to that, but yet, what about the problems with nuclear energy and the radioactive waste? So this is where it's going to require some very proactive, smart people to come together and address these. As I said, these types of remedies are going to have to be international in nature. Now, the question we would ask here, even in a democracy, can representative governments protect all interests? And when we talk about all interests, are we actually worried about people across our borders? Are we concerned about future peoples? Are we concerned about animals and plants and other species? Another new term here, can we create more of a biocracy from a democracy? So looking at the future of environmentalism, tend to see that the gloom and doom scenarios, which tend to come out every time there's a new report about global warming, well, that does tend to turn people off. In general, more pessimism, more resignation, even more apathy. So how do we go about adapting this environmental ideology? Well, we could start with looking at some other types of approaches, such as the bond between environmentalists and sportsmen, such as hunters who appreciate nature, and even though they maybe go out and hunting for particular other types of species, perhaps there could be some sort of coalition or bond there that would work on preserving nature. We also are looking at what they call a black-green alliance, which addresses environmental injustice, which we talked about a little bit before in one of the previous lectures on liberation ideologies, as to where most of the environmental injustice, and that's including where waste dumps and garbage dumps and chemical spills and things like that are typically happening near poor neighborhoods. So it's the poor and the minority populations that are suffering more environmental justice. So therefore, there could be a black-green alliance there. Again, addressing the exploitation of the poor in that case. Looking at concepts of fair trade as opposed to free trade, which, there's a fine line there. Free trade, of course, is what economists recommend to find the best product for the best price. But tempering that with fair trade that would address environmental disparities or overlooking environmental regulations in order to maximize trade, that sort of thing. And sustainability, of course, is one of the new buzzwords in this ideology, is that how can we figure out a way to continue to survive and grow and feed more people and make lives better, happier for more people, but yet being more sustainable. And then what we can also count on is that there may be more significant events, perhaps even catastrophic events. We may be even facing one that's certainly quite significant right now that is associated with our environment, whether it's disease or pollution. How we react to those, how we respond to those is also going to be an important part of this future environmental ideological approach. So this wraps up the chapter on ecology. So stay tuned for discussion question on that.